My name is Andre, and the story I'm about to tell you is not one I'm proud of. It's about a terrible mistake, about a pain that never goes away, and about how the thirst for revenge can transform anyone into something unrecognizable. It all started 3 years ago when my younger brother Lucas was brutally beaten and left for dead in an alley near the center of our city. Lucas was a quiet boy, more dreamy than practical. He liked music and was always scribbling melodies in a notebook that he carried everywhere. He had no enemies, at least that I knew of. When I heard the news of his death, I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The police said it was a robbery, that Lucas resisted and ended up being the victim of violence, but there was something in the way they described the case that didn't make sense. His injuries were personal, methodical, as if whoever did it had a motive, and that's why I started looking for answers on my own. I spent weeks searching the area around the place where Lucas was found. I spoke to homeless people, shopkeepers, and anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. Most of them had nothing to say, but some clues began to emerge. A waitress at a nearby bar mentioned that she had seen Lucas arguing with 3 young men the night he was killed. She didn't know their names, but she described one of them, a tall man with a scar on the left side of his face. The problem was that the police didn't seem interested in this information. To them, the case was already closed. Another young victim of urban violence. This filled me with anger, and my determination grew. If no one else was going to seek justice for Lucas, I would. Lucas wasn't one to get into trouble, but when I searched his room, I found something that made me uneasy. It was a string of text messages on his cell phone, exchanged with someone named Raphael. The messages showed a growing tension. Lucas was being pressured into something, and Raphael seemed to be at the center of it. Tracking Raphael wasn't hard. He was known in the neighborhood as someone involved in suspicious activities, petty theft, smuggling, and even organized fights. I discovered that he frequented an abandoned gym where the fights took place. That night, I watched from afar as Raphael fought. He was exactly as the waitress had described, tall, with a noticeable scar on his face. After the fight, I followed him to a bar. I decided to confront him right there. The conversation did not go as I expected. Raphael was aggressive and tried to intimidate me, but when I mentioned Lucas's name, his face changed. He seemed genuinely scared. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said. With a little more pressure, Raphael began to talk. He admitted that he had been with Lucas that night, but he claimed that what happened was not his fault. Lucas owed money to a man named Fabio, someone who controlled some of the illicit activities in the city. When Lucas failed to pay, Fabio and 2 other men decided to teach him a lesson. Raphael was there, but he insisted that he had not directly participated in the attack. The anger I felt when I heard this was like a punch in the stomach. I was on the verge of exploding, but I controlled myself. Raphael wasn't the end of the line. He was just another piece in the puzzle. Fabio was an influential and dangerous man, with connections ranging from petty criminals to important figures in the city. Getting to him wouldn't be easy, but Raphael, perhaps out of guilt or fear, gave me enough information to find him. The night I finally came face to face with Fabio, I felt a mix of adrenaline and fear. He was at a table in the back of a club, surrounded by men who clearly worked for him. I confronted him with the information I had, and Fabio didn't deny it. "Your brother got mixed up where he shouldn't have," he said disdainfully. "That was a warning, so others would know what happens to those who don't keep their promises." The coldness of his words left me speechless. He spoke of Lucas's life as if it were disposable. I left there determined to take justice into my own hands. The next few weeks were a blur. I studied Fabio's movements, his routine, and where he was vulnerable. I knew I couldn't count on the police. They were either bought off or simply didn't care. When I finally put my plan into action, I was prepared for anything. I waited for Fabio to leave one of his businesses late one night. He was alone, without his bodyguards. I approached him, and for the first time I saw a flash of fear in his eyes. "You killed my brother," I said. "Now you're going to pay for it." He tried to negotiate, but there was no room for conversation. I won't go into detail about what happened, but I can tell you that by the time I was done, Fabio was no longer a threat to anyone. Had I served justice? Maybe. But the feeling of emptiness remained. Nothing I did would bring Lucas back. Revenge may be sweet in the moment, but it leaves deep scars. I went home that night, knowing that I would never be the same. The police, as expected, never connected the dots. Fabio's death was recorded as a settling of scores between criminals, but I knew the truth, and that would be a weight that I would carry forever. What remained for me was the memory of Lucas. I still have the notebook where he scribbled his songs. Every now and then, I open it and let the melodies remind me of who he was, and not of how I lost him. If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and share it with your friends. Many more chilling stories are to come. My name is Elias. The last time I was in my hometown was over 20 years ago. When I left, I vowed that I would never set foot in that dry, forgotten land again. But here I am, guided by a letter that arrived on my doorstep a few weeks ago. It was from my sister Lara, and it contained only one sentence: "He's back." I knew exactly who he was. In that small town years ago, our father was accused of a horrible crime he didn't commit. He died shortly after, consumed by shame and humiliation. I always believed that one man was to blame: Ottavio, the former town chief. He had fabricated evidence, manipulated witnesses, and destroyed our family. The thought of Ottavio wandering freely, living his life as if nothing had happened, was unbearable. I decided to return, not only to understand what was happening, but to face the man who took everything from us. Arriving in the city was like walking through a portal to a forgotten time. The same weathered wooden houses, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and silence. Lara greeted me with a tight hug, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of relief and fear. She told me that Ottavio had reappeared months ago, after being missing for years. He was older, walking with difficulty, but he still had that arrogant air. The strangest thing, according to her, was that he seemed to be searching for something. He spent hours wandering the streets, staring at houses, as if trying to remember something. "Do you think he's sorry?" I asked. Lara just shook her head. "Men like him don't feel sorry, Elias. He must be hiding something." I decided to investigate. I visited places we used to go as children. The town bar was empty, except for a few old men who looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. When I mentioned Ottavio, silence was immediate. No one wanted to talk. It was at the market that I found the first clue. A woman named Donatella, who always had a sharp tongue, approached me. "You want to know about Ottavio? Ask him about the house at the end of the old road," she said. The house at the end of the old road. It was a place we avoided as children, an abandoned building that seemed out of place in the city. Lara was apprehensive when I mentioned it, but she didn't try to stop me. That night, I went to the house. The building was even more run down than I remembered, surrounded by tall weeds and absolute silence. I went in with a flashlight, and the smell of mold and rot almost made me back away. Upstairs, I found a room with strange marks on the walls. They looked like scratches, made by something or someone trying to get out. And there was a box in the corner, covered in dust. Inside it were old documents and photos. In one of them, I recognized Ottavio next to a group of men. They all looked nervous, as if they were about to do something they didn't want to be remembered for. Among the documents was a list of names. My father's name was there, and then, at the bottom of the box, I found a key. When I got home, Lara was awake, waiting for me. I showed her what I had found, and she looked as confused as I felt. "What do you think this means?" she asked. Before I could answer, we heard a noise coming from outside. It was Ottavio. He was standing in the middle of the street, looking directly at our house. I grabbed the key and decided it was time to confront him. Lara tried to stop me, but I was determined. "Do you think you can run away forever?" I asked as I approached. Ottavio smiled, but it was an empty smile. Run away? You don't understand, do you? He looked frailer than I remembered, but there was still something menacing about him. He didn't resist when I forced him into the car and drove him back to the house on the old road. The key I found in the box opened a safe hidden in the basement of the house. Inside were more documents, including a confession signed by Ottavio and the other men in the photo. They framed my father to cover up a bigger crime, the murder of a young woman who threatened to expose their corruption. Ottavio looked defeated but not remorseful. It was necessary, he said. Your father was the only weak link. Anger bubbled inside me. He had destroyed our lives, and now he spoke as if it were just a minor detail. Handing over the documents to the police was the right thing to do, but it did not bring peace. Ottavio was arrested, as were the others who were still alive, but the entire city was scarred by the revelation. Lara and I decided to sell the house and never return. Before leaving, I went to my father's grave, taking with me the only thing I had left of him, the truth. Revenge did not bring relief, but at least the silence had been broken, and sometimes that is enough to move on. My name is Ricardo Alves, and until recently, my life was the normal course of an accountant in a small town called Vale Serena. I had a wonderful wife, Maria, and a 7-year-old daughter, Anna. Everything changed one cold December night when a devastating fire consumed our home. Maria and Anna did not survive. The loss was unbearable, but what really devastated me was finding out that the fire was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of revenge by Lucas, a former co-worker whom I had reported for fraud. Lucas had always been jealous of my stability and the respect I had earned at the company. When I discovered his financial irregularities, I did not hesitate to report him. His reaction was violent. After I reported him, he began to persecute me, spreading lies about me and my family. The culmination of all this was the fire that took everything from me. Now I feel that nothing else matters but bringing justice, or revenge, for Lucas. With the police declaring the fire an accident and no direct evidence linking Lucas, I decided I needed to take matters into my own hands. My trust in the authorities had been depleted. With my savings spent on funeral and medical expenses, the only thing I had left was a plan. I researched Lucas, finding out where he lived, his habits, and his routine. Serena Valley was too small to hide anything, but Lucas seemed to know how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. I spent days discreetly following him, observing his movements. He lived in a modest house far from the city centre. He had few friends, and his behaviour had become increasingly erratic after the complaint. He avoided social gatherings and spent a lot of time alone, which gave me the perfect opportunity to plot my revenge. Finally, I felt the time to act. It was a Friday night, and Lucas was alone in his apartment. I decided to confront him in person. I arrived in the early hours of the morning when the city was asleep. I knocked on the door and anxiety took over me. When he opened the door, his face was pale, but his eyes reflected the same arrogance they always had. "Ricardo," he said with a forced smile, "I never thought you would come here." "This isn't about apologies, Lucas," I replied, trying to remain calm. "It's about justice." Before I could say more, he tried to push me inside. I struggled to pull away, and in the confusion, the fire alarm went off. In the midst of the panic, we saw the flames spreading through the curtains. We both tried to get out, but the thick smoke disoriented me. Lucas fell to the floor, and I felt like I had lost control again. I ran outside, but the fire consumed his house in minutes. The police arrived shortly after, but again, nothing was proven. Lucas disappeared as if he had never existed. With each passing day, my thirst for revenge only grew. I realized that I needed to understand Lucas's mind to truly get to him. I reached out to former co-workers, friends, and even family members, trying to piece together a complete picture of who he really was. I discovered that Lucas was leading a double life, involved in illegal activities that went beyond the fraud he had committed. Among the reports, I heard stories of veiled threats and mysterious encounters. Lucas was connected to a network of corruption that reached higher levels than I had ever imagined. My investigation took me to dangerous places, where the line between right and wrong was constantly blurred. Each discovery took me deeper into the city's underworld, where revenge became a visceral need. I knew that confronting Lucas directly was too risky, so I decided to set a trap. I used my accounting skills to manipulate his finances and leave him vulnerable. I closed fictitious deals, increasing his debts without him realizing it. My goal was to drive him to financial ruin, the same ruin he had tried to impose on me. Months of planning finally paid off. Lucas began to show signs of stress, desperately trying to hide his losses. He became paranoid, avoiding meetings and isolating himself even more. I knew I was close, but the perfect opportunity to confront him had not yet arrived. When I realized he was vulnerable, I knew it was time to act. The chosen night was cold and quiet. I knew Lucas would be passing by a quiet bar, trying to gather the strength to deal with his debts. I was hiding in the shadows, watching his every move. When he entered the bar, he looked weaker and more broken than ever. I calmly approached the bar, pretending to be a regular customer. I ordered a drink and, taking advantage of the distraction, placed a small gun under the bar. As he sat down, I gathered my courage and approached him. "Lucas," I called, my voice shaking slightly, "it's time for you to face the consequences." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting fear and recognition. "Do you think you can stop me, Ricardo?" He tried to smile, but his face was pale, his strength waning. Before I could act, I heard sirens in the distance. The police were coming. In a desperate impulse, I made the decision that would change everything. In the heat of the moment, I dropped the gun and ran. The sound of the sirens and the spotlights beginning to illuminate the place left me with no alternative. Lucas, still pale, looked at me with a mixture of sadness and relief. "You didn't do this for me," he said, before being handcuffed by the police. I was arrested on charges of attempted murder and obstruction of justice. As I walked to the cell, I felt a mixture of triumph and emptiness. I thought revenge would bring me peace, but now I was only more lost than before. The justice I sought on my own condemned me in a way I never imagined. In the cell, I reflected on everything that had happened. The loss of Maria and Anna still haunted me, but Lucas's death did not bring the satisfaction I had hoped for. I realized that true revenge does not heal wounds, it only creates new scars. Now, trapped and alone, I understood that the thirst for revenge can consume even the best intentions, leaving only darkness.